a female doctor was attacked inside a public hospital. In Ghodki, a 17-year-old girl suffered burns to her face and eyes after her cousin allegedly threw acid at her. In Lahore, a schoolgirl was seriously injured in another suspected acid attack. 3 cases, 3 different cities, no direct connection. But together, they point to the same question. Why is acid violence still happening in Pakistan more than a decade after the country passed landmark laws to stop it? For survivors, the attack does not end when the acid is washed away. Acid violence is one of the most brutal forms of abuse because the intent is often not just to kill. It is to punish, to permanently mark, to control a person's sense of identity, mobility, confidence, and place in public life.
The medical treatments are not top of the line, except if you go to some private hospitals. That is very expensive. It's expensive for us also to take these girls to such facilities where there are good facilities, but we're good with the government hospitals, and it's not that they get free treatment. They would still have to pay. We still have to pay, not just for the medicine but for the blood, for her to get the operation as soon as possible. Otherwise she will have to wait till the operation date has been given to her. So 72 hours, very bad, painful, the whole body swells up, and if the first aid is not given properly, acid seeps into the body and can actually affect the organs also. And that is the point where we make sure that this girl is sedated. I mean, we make sure means the doctors, and she can't see a mirror.
In Pakistan, women and girls make up the majority of victims, which makes acid violence a deeply gendered crime. Advocacy groups and researchers have linked these attacks to rejected marriage proposals, domestic disputes, family conflicts, and attempts to enforce patriarchal control. When men are attacked, the motives are often different, usually linked to property, marriage, or other personal disputes. But the logic of the violence is similar. Acid is used as a weapon of permanent punishment. The numbers are difficult to track because Pakistan does not have a recent, reliable national data set on acid attacks. But older estimates show the scale of the problem. According to the Acid Survivors Foundation, more than 1,200 acid attack cases were reported in Pakistan between 2007 and 2015. A 2013 report by the UK's Department for International Development estimated that between 150 and 400 acid attacks were reported annually in the country, with women making up for most of the victims. And part of the reason this crime persists is simple. Acid is cheap, accessible, and easy to misuse. In many agricultural and industrial areas, corrosive chemicals have historically been available because they are used in farming, textile production, cleaning, and manufacturing. That legitimate use has made regulation difficult. But weak regulation has also made abuse easier.
There needs to be more stringent regulation of acid sales. Right now, the only restriction in the law, at least to the extent of Punjab, is the age of 18. There are no other restrictions. The restrictions are at the business level. You have to apply to the government to obtain a license, but for a common layman can walk into any licensed business which is selling acid and purchase acid. There is no record of who's buying the acid, in what quantity they're buying the acid, what are they buying the acid for. So that is a problem, and this is something that needs to be regulated very, very heavily. We either need to look into banning a sale of acid to private individuals, or we need to have a proper digital system in place. I think the first option might be too unrealistic, but we need to have a proper system in place, a digitization record of all sales of acids. So you record who is buying the acid, you include biometric verification of the purchaser. Why is the acid being purchased? In what quantity is the acid being purchased? So the government has real-time data on where acid is moving. So firstly, that's a huge gap in legislation. The second gap, in my opinion, obviously comes in terms of enforcement, because the law is there in terms of criminalizing the offense. We can't say that there's no law that exists on the book, but any law is as good as its enforcement. Without enforcement, it's just a piece of paper.
When this kind of an incident takes place, the families are very embarrassed. They don't want to report it. They don't want to tell anybody. They always say, it's an accident, she was cleaning the bathroom and the acid fell on her. And then of course she's kind of never married again, or if she's already married and she's got girls and she's been thrown acid, she comes back to her parental home, and sometimes in spite of the fact that she's been thrown acid in the same house, she still lives there because she doesn't have any place else to go.
For years, acid attacks were treated like ordinary assault cases. That began to change in 2011 when Pakistan introduced landmark legislation making acid violence a specific criminal offence. The law made acid attacks non-bailable and non-compoundable, with punishments ranging from 14 years in prison to lifelong imprisonment, along with heavy fines. In 2014, lawmakers pushed further reforms through the Acid and Burn Crime Bill, strengthening investigation and trial procedures and laying the groundwork for tighter regulation of acid sales. Then in 2018, another law expanded the state's responsibility by promising medical treatment, rehabilitation, and legal assistance for survivors. On paper, Pakistan had moved from punishment to protection, but in practice, the gap between law and enforcement remained wide. Conviction rates improved after the 2011 reforms, but they were still low. Official data previously showed convictions rising from an average of around 6% before the legal changes to 18% in 2012. But prosecutions remained weak. Many survivors still struggle to get cases registered correctly, and at one point, the prosecution rate stood at only 35%.
The lack of conviction, again, is you can boil it down to procedural issues. Evidence was not collected properly. Chain of custody may have been broken of the samples collected, of any evidence that was collected from the crime scene. The police did not record the events correctly, and the issue being that police here are not properly trained on specifically how to address or how to manage crime scenes of these situations, or how to make sure that the investigation and the recording of the investigation is done properly. Lastly, and I think this is very important, is gender sensitivity training. A lot of our public officials, so police officials, public prosecutors, court staff, judges in courts lack gender sensitivity training, and when those attitudes are extended to women who have already exercised a lot of conviction and exercised a lot of courage to come to court, when they're met with those attitudes, it is absolutely a deterrent and absolutely discourages women from going through, or it discourages other women who may be thinking about going to court. So that's something that I think it also needs to be. We need to make sure that gender sensitivity training becomes a core principle of training when we're talking about public officials involved with the criminal justice system. Now, after 2011, rates of conviction have gone up. That's a well-documented thing. Activists who work in this area have reported that there has been an increase in conviction. But again, as any ordinary lawyer or any litigant who's dealing with the courts on the criminal side can tell you, the process itself is rife with delays. So from registering an FIR to investigation to collection of evidence, there can be issues at every single stage, and and these issues become more acute when we're dealing with issues of gender-based violence. Because again, women in this country, there's a lot of stigma about going to courts. There's a lot of stigma about the ideas of honor being attached to women's bodies. So firstly, coming itself, like reporting a crime, that's the first problem. So there needs to be a lot more encouragement on the state level of facilitating women who report these crimes. There needs to be processes put in place when these women come to courts. They are protected. They are not exposed to their attackers. They're provided safe environments where they can go through that entire process of trial. We need to have better training about evidence collection, because a lot of times, if you read criminal judgments, convictions, acquittals take place because the evidence collection wasn't done correct. The chain of custody was broken at some point. There was a delay in lodging of the FIR. So these procedural lacunas, they're not specific to acid attacks. They're just prevalent all across the criminal system. So those are problems that need to be fixed across the board. Now, coming to specifically other issues that can be addressed when it comes to victims of acid attacks, I think I'd just like to, I guess, might be odd timing or might be, some sort of serendipity that's at play here, that the Supreme Court, I know we're all we were all really, really shocked by the Dr. Manur case, which is, on the headlines right now. The Supreme Court has just issued a very, very comprehensive judgment on acid attacks. So I'll just briefly go into the factual history, and then I'll address some of the things that I'd like to point out. It was a conviction that from the Islamabad Anti-Terrorism Court, which was appealed to the Lahore High Court. The Lahore High Court upheld it, and then there was an appeal to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court upheld the conviction, 14 years imprisonment, 10 lakh compensation. But the Supreme Court also went into the nature of acid attacks, and it described it as these attacks as being worse than murder. Because the idea being, if somebody's been murdered, well, in some ways, as morbid as it sounds, their misery has ended. They're not in continuing pain. Whereas a victim of an acid attack is now subject to a life of pain and agony and of social ostracism, of psychological trauma, of physical trauma. And that kind of pain, that kind of misery is very rarely applicable in other cases.
Human rights advocates say the problem is not just the law, it is everything around it. Survivors can face pressure from families to withdraw complaints, witnesses may refuse to testify, cases can drag on for years. Police may mishandle the initial investigation, and in some cases, confusion over whether trials belong in regular criminal courts or anti-terrorism courts can create further delays. For a survivor already dealing with burns, surgeries, trauma, and stigma, the legal process can become another wound. Justice is one part of the story, recovery is another. Reconstructive surgeries can take years and cost more than most families can afford. Psychological support is limited. Many survivors struggle to return to school, work, marriage, or public life. Groups such as the Acid Survivors Foundation and the People Like Smile Again Foundation have played an important role in rehabilitation, vocational training, medical assistance, and public awareness. But advocates say support cannot depend mainly on charities and NGOs. Survivors need long-term, state-backed care. Because surviving the attack is only the first part. The harder part is rebuilding a life afterwards.
I have salons all over Pakistan, and it is mandatory for every salon owner to keep at least 2 victims in their salons. Now, there are clients who come to us and they would say, Appa, please give me another girl. I don't want to get a treatment from her. Why? I always tell them that if she's not giving you the kind of treatment that you want, then I understand. Just because she has got a mutilated face or a body, please don't do that. Nee, this is a drama that you're creating. I'm not creating a drama, they're there. So I tell them, then you can leave and take services wherever you want to do and whatever you want to take.
Once an acid attack has happened, there needs to be better support systems in place that are supported and facilitated by the government. So if you look at a lot of these things, a lot of the support systems, the rehabilitation, the restoration, the help with obtaining legal services, the help with obtaining health services, that is all being done on an NGO level by advocacy organizations, non-profits who are working to sort of support victims of acid attacks. I think the government absolutely needs to step in, take ownership of this issue, and I think the Supreme Court's recommendations are on point. Provide all kinds of support, so economic support, support for all kinds of reconstructive surgery, psychological support, and make sure that these victims are supported, they're rehabilitated back into society. So there is one is that aspect, and the other aspect, again, I think if you take away the ability for a potential attacker to gain access to the acid, so even if they're planning an attack, you are between 10 people who are planning an attack, you are potentially reducing that number down to maybe 3 or 2. Illegal substances are always available. You can always find a way to obtain them.
Recently, the Supreme Court of Pakistan issued a major ruling on acid violence, calling it more heinous than murder and upholding a life sentence in an acid attack case. The court also called for tighter controls on asset sales, including a ban on open sale to private individuals and a centralized digital system with buyer details, photographs, and biometric verification. It recommended strict monitoring of trial timelines, compensation for victims, rehabilitation funds, medical and psychological support, disability certificates, job quotas, and welfare benefits for survivors. In other words, the court recognized what survivors and rights groups have been saying for years. Punishment alone is not enough. The real question is not whether Pakistan has laws against asset violence. It does. The real question is what happens after those laws are passed.
The state has got a very important role there. Even if the person has been pardoned by the family or the woman, the cases should still go on. The punishment should be there. It has to be it is not the severity of the punishment but the certainty of the punishment, which is very important at this point. In Justice Khosa's Supreme Court hearing, there was a woman who says, okay, I would like to pardon my husband and I'll take the case back. And Justice Khosa says, no, you have pardoned him, Allah Ta'ala will give you ajr for that. But the state will still carry on. In fact, he gave more years for him to spend, in jail. So it is very important that the state takes up its role. They should be providing much more. They should be providing them work. They should be providing them safe, secure environment also to work also and to start a business. But giving me a medal or appreciating the girls who are always present there when they've got an event where they want the girls victim to sit in front row, that is not helping them. It's like they want to show and prove it to the public that they've helped them. No, they have not helped them. So state is only there to make law. Implementation also comes to us.
If asset can still be bought easily, if cases are still hard to prosecute, if survivors still rely on NGOs for treatment, and if rehabilitation remains uncertain, then every new attack becomes a reminder of the same failure. Making a crime punishable is not the same as making it disappear.